Hello, my name is Dave Marks, the Spy Guy, and this is my guest, MoneyCircus, and we're here to talk about Iran. He lives in Georgia, and he was just telling me about how much of the buildup he was able to watch, given the fact that Georgia is basically in the midst of the center of both Ukraine and Iran.
Yeah, we're just south of Ukraine, and we're a little bit west of Iran, so you can watch the planes going over. That's the um, unusual situation that we're in here, but it's nice to join you. It's great to be able to give you what limited insight I have.
Mhm.
Um, uh, you know, proximity to a situation is not necessarily insight, but we'll see where we can go.
Yeah, exactly. No, well, yeah. So I'm a little surprised that it's kicked off. I thought we were going. This was. I thought, like much like Venezuela, this was going to be like kind of a smash and grab on maybe the Ayatollah or something like that. But I mean, Iran's an enormous nation. It's not Iraq. It's not Venezuela in the sense that you can just grab one guy. It is the whole IRGC apparatus, which I feel is what really has taken over the country. And I don't think the Ayatollahs are necessarily in as much control as they used to be, in the sense that they created this Waffen SS like unit, and it's basically runs the show and won't let people like the civilian government or the Ayatollahs to make the real decisions. It's the IRGC that needs to go.
That's an insightful comment. I mean, of course, mentioning Waffen SS is going to, light some fires for some people, but it was, of course, a functional uh, spear of the regime in the Third Reich context, and in that way, it is a parallel in Iran. It's interesting when you look at the whole Iranian story. You get so many aspects to this, but it's you don't need to go into the weeds to realize that there were several levels to the Ukrainians to the Iranian story. Sorry, I'm
Mm.
living just 900 miles south of Ukraine, so I slip into that. There's
Mm.
several levels to the Iranian story, which is that no one has really ever adequately explained the so-called revolution of 1979. And
Mhm.
whenever I hear the word revolution, the hair goes up on the back of my neck in the sense that revolution or putsch, you know what I
Mm.
mean? They're normally interchangeable.
Mhm.
And you've got, I would suggest, two, perhaps three levels of government in Iran. You've got the theocracy, which we call in the West the mullahs, who are, in a sense, the cultural glue.
Mhm.
Or you might say the imposed cultural glue, because of course there's another cultural glue. But this is the narrative that is running the country. And then you've got the permanent bureaucracy, and I say never underestimate this. It's remarkable that we in the West still struggle with this concept of the deep state, because it's long been known that if you look at France, where supposedly there was a big revolution, and it predated the American Revolution, it was supposed to be this great overthrowing of the European ruling elite, and yet many of the families who were the bureaucratic uh, commissars of France under Louis XIV are still there today,
Mm.
taking their places in the European Commission, etc., etc. Bureaucracies don't go away. And in that sense, the Iranian bureaucracy has to be seen in the same context. That you can't say that it's the mullahs. No, this is a long-standing group, many of whom would have worked under the Shah, and many of whom are still there today, because they're basically the ones who
Yeah,
know
there's a
how the
couple.
system runs.
Yes, there's a couple examples from history that I remember. It's when Metternich was overthrown in the revolutions of 1848, he and one of his lieutenants are being escorted out of the building, and the lieutenant says, "What about all those people over there?" Meaning all the typewriter guys operating the typewriters. And Metternich is like, "They'll go on forever."
Exactly, they're not leaving.
Yeah.
They're not leaving.
And then
And then
the other example is there's a German guy who was with the Gestapo, and he was just said like, Hitler, there's a fascist. I would still be here if the communists had won and not the Hitler and the fascists. Like, that's how it works.
and we have
Every
many
police officer for either side.
we have many examples. The European Commission is probably the melting pot of exactly this group. We have so many, such as I can't even remember her extended title, but the High Commissioner, Her Excellency, the High Commissioner for Foreign Affairs, Kaja Kallas,
Mhm.
who rails and rails against Russia, and yet whose father was this long-standing commissar of the Soviet Union. These are people who are of a class who slip between one and the other. I mean, they see their job as to rule, their entitlement is to rule. And in fact, it's not they who change, it's the system above them that changes. I mean, oh, well, yes, that was the communists, and this is the whatever, but we're still here. And you can say the same of Ursula von der Leyen. You can say, well, it gets a boring game to pick out the families who are the fascists and the communists in the European Commission, because they're all the same damn group. But anyway, just to return to Iran. So we've got the mullahs at the top, we've got the permanent bureaucracy in the middle, and then we've what you call the tip of the spear, the Iranian core, the guard, the Revolutionary Guard, who again are I'm not going to speak for them. The commitment may or may not be to the theocracy, but their job is to do the military end of the things. So you've got three groups that have potentially different points of view or different allegiances, and the attempt, obviously, of the West is to sort of get in there and pry them apart and see if it can get one of these three layers that it can work with and dispense of the other two. And that seems to be what's going on. Of course, you can get deeper into the weeds, and I won't, because I don't have the expertise. But there are people who point to the fact that when the original Ayatollah Khomeini was expelled from Iraq, that the French first thought of giving him asylum in Algeria, and they said, no, let's just take him to Paris. And he moved to Paris. He sat there for a while. He managed to run his entire operation from France with in those days, it wasn't internet, of course, it was cassette tapes carried by the PLO or whomever across the region, and to build up his network. And again, this is not to take particularly a point, even to take a point for or against. It's simply to note how this worked, and to note that he was ensconced within France. And what did we say now about how does that influence our view of which group is being unseated? I don't know. Maybe it is the front man that the West from time to time likes to topple over, in the way that we did use Saddam Hussein against Iran, and then the time came not to use him. We did use Gaddafi, and then the time came not to use him. In a sense, the first bit makes more sense, who we use and why we use them. The second bit, the point at which we dispose of people, to put it crudely, is the bit that's less understood. Nobody quite understands, at what point the relationship soured. And then we decided, okay, right, we've got to move on to the next person.
Well,
It's
I was watching Tucker Carlson's latest guest. I can't remember her name, but she was a big person in the first Bush administration.
Catherine Austin Fitts.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
she suggested the reason why a lot of this is happening has nothing to do with Israel. It has to do with the fact that these guys aren't going along with the CBDCs. These guys wanted to have their own, they were not on board with creating a digital currency. And that's why they had to be toppled and had to be gotten rid of. And Iran is the last one of the people on that list of countries that were planning to go on a gold-based currency.
Yeah, I disagree slightly, because I think if you take the Wesley Clark 7 countries in 5 years, the preceding were more or less committed to their own currencies, and famously Libya wanted to launch a gold dinar for Africa. Iraq wanted to trade its oil in its own currency. Even France wanted to trade oil for gold, and the head of the French oil company Total, a guy called Christophe de Margerie, died on the tarmac in Moscow as his plane was taking off after a meeting with the Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. So this is a long-standing thing, but I think in the case of Iran, it gets a bit more complicated. I think Iran is, as far as I can see, on the side with the CBDCs. It's not so independent financially. This goes back to the connections of Khomeini with France and with Switzerland. It's not clear that Iran is against the CBDC. I think there are, in Iran's case, other reasons, and of course the big one has to be oil. And we have to look at the connection between what happened in Venezuela and what's happening in Iran, and note that both of them are 2 of the biggest oil producers in the world.
Yeah.
And that their potential customers are the Chinese. Maybe it's a precursor to going after China. Or maybe it's just this reshaping of the petrodollar. Some people get, again, deep into the weeds on what happened to the petrodollar. Did the petrodollar die? No, it didn't. The US-Saudi relationship exists in a lesser state than it used to. But both sides are looking more broadly. The Saudis are more willing to do deals with countries other than the United States and in their own currencies. And the US is saying, okay, well, can we make the petrodollar less tied to the Saudis and more a homegrown petrodollar that the US controls? And to do that, we need to have not just a self-sufficient oil producing country in the US, but we also need, of course, the exports, control over the exports. And with exports, or as with corporations, you don't need to own them to control them. You don't need to actually say, okay, we've sent in our corporations, and our corporations own and stamp their name on every barrel of Venezuelan oil. You basically have to influence the direction of the flow of the business. And if they can do that to Iran as well, then you basically can take the petrodollar home and say, well, this is the Washington petrodollar, not the Riyadh petrodollar. And I think there's an element of that as well. And of course, you've also got, mentioned earlier, the Tucker Carlson Huckabee interview. That was quite a big thing in terms of taking the lid off the expansion of Israel as a greater regional influence, whether it literally takes land or, as I've just said, plays a kind of deciding role in the control of that land. It doesn't necessarily need to be a formal greater Israel, as is as was discussed by Carlson. I suspect it just needs to be a hegemony.
Yeah.
It needs to be a greater power in the region. And that perhaps is tied. Now, this is way above my pay grade, but maybe if you relate the idea of the petrodollar going from Riyadh to Washington, maybe there's a different role for Israel in influencing the region after the withdrawal or partial withdrawal of the US as guardian of Saudi Arabia. I don't know.
Yep.
That's my thoughts.
Yeah, there's also the fact, yeah, I've heard definitely people say that the need for Israel to change from being what it is now to being like the high-tech center hub for the Middle East is going to be, it's probably its ultimate destination of being the innovation factory for all those Muslims that are surrounding it. Well, we've been having some technical issues here today, so hopefully we get reestablished. But yeah, so are you back? Nope. No, he's not. We're having some issues before the stream. Hopefully, the connection, the Starlink connection in Georgia might not be as up to date as for some other places. I remember often listening to Tom Longo's podcast, and he'd be talking about how Starlink in Florida was not the best connection in the world. Yeah, it's good to learn.
That's a little bit better. It seems to be there now. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, we're getting into kind of normally we're always talking current affairs, and it's nice having to get into some of the history of all this stuff, which you're giving us today, Money.
Yeah, the history of it is great fun, of course. With Iran, we go back to 1953. In fact, we can go back to the 1870s, which was the first approach towards then Persia by a German banker who later became known as Paul Reuter, the founder of the news agency.
Oh, wow.
And he was from a banking family, though far less notable than the Rothschilds. But he went out to Persia and did a deal. He struck something, I think it was 1871, called the Reuter Concession, where he took he got a kind of 30 or 40-year concession over all kinds of minerals and transport and energy and tobacco. And this led the British future Foreign Secretary, Lord Curzon, to say that this was an outrageous grab, the greatest concession that anybody had ever taken of another country. And the British succeeded in quashing it. So I suspect this wasn't really a British land grab. It was more a kind of a German banking land grab because the British quashed it. And then a guy called William Darcy, who was an Australian Brit in 1900 roughly, did finally get the concession for Persian oil. And this is the gradual lead up to what became the British Persian Oil Company, later BP, or at first it was the Anglo-Persian. And the British ran this Persian oil contract with the French largely up until the 1950s, when the Mohammad Mossadegh, the Persian prime minister, came in. He nationalized it. This is a very well-known story. The British then tried to launch a coup against him. They got stuck in the mud. They couldn't make it work. They brought in the CIA. The CIA made it happen, and in return, of course, they had to let the US in on the oil deal, because in the meantime, the US had been in Saudi Arabia because they'd been excluded from Persia by the British and the French. They said, okay, we'll go to Saudi. Well, of course, Saudi then turned out to be a pot of gold. We were very happy with Saudi. And through helping the British and the French in 1953, they got into Persia as well. So that was the history of it. And of course, you can make a strong argument that the banking and oil industry, oil interests, oil and bank has always basically been in the modern sector the same thing. I mean, they've been the same companies. If you go back to Russia at the turn of the century, you had the French branch of the Rothschild family. You had the Nobel family, the brothers of Alfred Nobel of the Nobel Prize, the Dynamite King. They were active in Russia. So you had the Nobels, the Rothschilds, and Rockefeller. And interestingly, Rockefeller cut his teeth in Russia. He was already active in the US, but it was the Rothschilds, apparently, according to American research that I've read, who basically taught him that what he needed to control was not so much the drilling. He didn't need to go crazy for drilling oil. He needed to control the supply and the transport of the oil, because then you control basically the spigot that goes to the customer. And Rockefeller took that knowledge back to the US, and that's what created his empire in the US. And of course, then 1905 was the first Russian revolution. And what appears to have been happening is that in 1901, Russia had briefly, for 1 year, eclipsed the US as the world's largest oil producer. And it seems that the point was to take the Russians out of the market, take them out, because there's two things you can do with a competitor. You can take over your competitor. Well, okay, put it through this. You can undercut them. You can take them over, or you can put them out of the market. And what was done to Russia very effectively, it was put out of the market for 50 years. After the revolution of 1917, or the putsch of 1917, it took 50 years for Russia to regain the oil production that it had in 1901. So it was effectively put out of the market, which was great, of course, if you're Rockefeller. And the Rockefellers, Rothschilds, Nobels, they basically sold their interests in Russia. Rothschilds did it in 1905, time of the first revolution, and they put their money into Royal Dutch Shell. So they were co-owner of Royal Dutch Shell. The Nobels sold theirs, and Rockefeller supposedly held on to his holdings until after the Russian Revolution, and then managed to negotiate a deal with the Bolsheviks whereby he got some recompense for his assets. That's Russia. Now I tell that story just because it's useful background to what's happening in Iran. Iran's another great historic, oil prospect, and it's in a world where the monetary system is being reset, where the post-World War II order is going down, and we're looking to, the chips are on the table, and people are looking, okay, well, what's going to be the new situation? If you are able to use the military power to rejig Iran again, as it has been previous times, why wouldn't you try? There's two ways to take over the Iranian oil industry. Of course, one would be just to contract, in which case, the Iranian government owns the oil and licenses it to the oil companies. That way you get the oil. But that doesn't give you the ability to lend against it. In order to use it to recollateralize the monetary system, you need to own the oil system. And for that reason, you need to get in there and you need to basically have banks in a position to either own or to have long-term concessions against which they can lend, and then they can raise money, and then they can recollateralize against it. And I suspect that's why the interest is to get into Iran not as a customer, but as the beneficial owner of the oil in Iran, so that it can then be used as a counterpoint, by the way, a very useful counterpoint to the Venezuelan oil. I'll shut up to let you jump in. But the one thing everybody has learned in the past few months, which they didn't need to know before, is that Venezuelan oil is known as sticky, crude, heavy crude. Think the Caribbean basin. Where does your tarmac come from? Your asphalt, your road covering, it comes from the Great Pitch Lake in Trinidad. Trinidad is just off the coast of Venezuela. It's 12 miles from Venezuela. That pitch lake, where they basically dig the tarmac out of the ground and lay the roads, that's related to the same oil basin as Venezuela controls. So it's real thick stuff.
Yeah.
And you go over to Iran, and you've got the stuff that needs to be blended with it, which is the really thin, the light, sweet crude. And so you've got the two parts that you put together. And if you put those two parts together, then you've got a product that can supply the world. So there's a kind of a petrochemical reason for wanting to have the Iranian oil, not just a geopolitical reason to push the mullahs out, or a banking reason to take control of the oil. There's a good petrochemical reason for it as well.
Yeah, well, that's good to understand that and kind of give us an understanding of what's going on in the world. See, so many times we get kind of focused on the different aspects of the ideas. Israel becomes the number one talking issue out there, and it's like, no, this has very little to. Israel's a part of it, but there's so much more going on, and the Israeli obsession is kind of like a psyop to keep people not looking at the larger picture of like the two. We want the two different types of oil so we can make gasoline.
Yeah. I take the Israeli story, the Israel story, largely as a narrative, and I'm not going to get into it because it's a whole other eschatological story, but there is a point where everybody needs narratives which sort of binds the society together and pulls them into the project, And Israel's got its story, and we know very much from the religious parties on the, they're called far right. Well, I've dispensed with far right and far left, but the very religious parties have their line, and everybody knows that very, very well. And you have the Christian Zionists who provide, some leverage for that within the US. But at the end of the day, not to diminish religion, but it has a narrative purpose when it comes to politics. I mean, that's the purpose of religion. We all wish religion would be left aside from politics. Like the old saying, you don't raise it at the dinner table unless you want to give everybody indigestion. But it's the resource wars. None of this would happen without the reality of the resource wars. People could sit and talk forever, reading from the Bible or whatever, but none of that would take effect in politics unless there were resource-based reasons for it to do so. And that's the view I take.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, I think what happened with the Charlie Kirk story and his death, I'm not convinced Israel had anything to do with that because the way they normally operate, they were at a very early stage of like just the beginning of threatening him over money. Like shooting him at that time would be not very useful for them. They were still threatening at threatening the money. It just started the threatening the money stage. For me, I think it's internal corruption inside the organization that might have led to that. But for the larger story,
I think you're right. I think the story of internal corruption is coming up, and I think that has much further to much more there to be exposed. And yeah, it could well turn out that the disagreement with Israel, which was real as far as we can see from his emails, but that being the reason for his demise may turn out to be a cover story. Absolutely could be. Just as we also know that the intelligence agencies all work together and all use each other from time to time as the the one to blame. I mean, after all, if you've got three groups working together, let's just say in this case, the Mossad, CIA, or any other of the 17 US intelligence agencies, the MI6 in Britain, or whichever intelligence agency is privately run, because actually the major banking families, the Vatican, the oil companies all have their independent intelligence agencies.
Right.
Shell is well known to have its own independent intelligence agency. Any of these individual groups could have an interest in deflecting blame from its own personal interest. They may sometimes coalesce and agree, and they may sometimes disagree. And what you're going to see in the alternative media is only a different variant to what you're going to see in the establishment media, which is going to be a cover story, to put it bluntly. I mean, they're not going to point the finger directly because your job depends on it. As Tucker Carlson said in his chat with the chap who runs the Redacted podcast, Clayton Morris, you couldn't, when they were on Fox, they couldn't directly talk as we are talking when they're discussing wars. They couldn't directly talk about the military-industrial complex. In other words, to suggest that there are corporations that profit from war was a kind of a no-no on Fox News. It's ridiculous in our context. Well, of course, there are people who profit from war. But there are layers of deception, layers of not deception, I would say comfort for the viewer. And one layer of comfort, the bottom layer of comfort, the big duvet that keeps the folks at home comfortable in front of their TV and not spitting out their coffee while they're watching the TV in the kitchen, is not to tell them things like the big military employer down the road is profiting from the deaths of American soldiers. No, you do not say that. So the degree to which we comfort and shield ourselves from the truth, it can't be underestimated, or do I mean overestimated? I mean, it's ludicrous. We hide ourselves from the truth to a tremendous degree. It's like filling our ears with cotton wool.
No, it's just another thing I was going to say about the Charlie Kirk thing was that basically what was happening for him was that, because I'm Anglican, I was rather surprised to hear about Schofield and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, wait, what? This is heresy. Like, there's nothing special about Jews. We're supposed to convert them to Christianity, and that's what was happening. He was telling all these young Christians in America to go read the Bible, and they suddenly read the Bible and realized that everything that the Christian Zionists had been telling them was garbage. And they started confronting Charlie Kirk about it. And then he, I guess, must have read it. And he's like, oh, crap. Everything, all these people around me are lying to younger generations because of this heresy that's infiltrated our churches.
I mean, if you think of the big changes in history, and because the obvious one we all reach back to is the Reformation in England. When I was at school, we were taught that it was purely about divorce. It was just, Henry VIII wanted a new wife, and the Pope wouldn't give him his divorce. So he said, okay, Pope, I'm going to kick you out of the country. Well, of course, that wasn't the story at all.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it was one comfortable duvet muffler to cover the reality, which was more complicated and more difficult for people to get to grips with. I mean, one, of course, was that the balance of power between the monasteries and the monarch, or more importantly, probably the monasteries and the barons, because the monarch couldn't have acted without the barons, had shifted. This is, just as far as I can see, is just not studied enough in academia. I mean, what was it that transitioned in society that caused the monasteries, who had been not just the kind of the hospitalers, the inns where you went when you were sick or starving, but also the sources of science and technology, the greatest developments of agriculture, such as the agricultural revolution, couldn't have happened without the monasteries. They were the progenitors of the agricultural revolution. Everything which came up to that point was developed in the monasteries, because they were great landowners, and they were effectively the research institutes of the day. And then suddenly their power fell away, and the monarch and his barons went in there and stole their wealth, burned their libraries, knocked down their buildings, took the stones away, and built the country houses, the English country houses, which were all built with the stones for the monasteries. This is a story that's half told. It's one of those great stories of the transitions of civilization. And then, of course, another one is what happened to the thought, the civilization and the thoughts of the people. For example, again, I was taught in an English school that under Elizabeth I, Henry's daughter, the English were being rather naughty, and they weren't being good Protestants, and we needed to have these kind of laws, very strict laws, that if you didn't attend church, three Sundays out of 4, you would get a visit from the police. And Britain effectively became or England it was at that time, it wasn't Britain yet, it wasn't the UK. There was the possibility of being hung for sedition, because sedition towards the state was conflated with sedition towards the church. If you weren't a good Protestant, you were suspected as being seditious towards the Queen. Well, that's kind of a really interesting point, because we have a parallel of that today. That if your thoughts aren't correct, you might be a terrorist, you might be a threat to the government. And that's what they were told in Elizabeth's England. And I make the case that was the world's first modern police state. Now, in England, again, going back to my school days in the 1970s, this was Gloriana, the happiest day. This was Greensleeves. You remember Greensleeves, that lovely song of people dancing around a maypole, and everything was innocent and glorious in England. And Elizabeth I was the Virgin Queen. She never got married because she was just too pure and beautiful. And yet this was a police state. Now, why can we be sure it was a police state? Well, because at least in the beginning of her reign, and it was a very long reign, everybody alive had been born a Catholic and had been baptized a Catholic, and believed, that if they betrayed their Catholicism, that was perdition. That was the end of them.
Yeah.
And suddenly they were told they had to negate that. So again, whether you look at it from a Catholic or a Protestant point of view, it was extremely brutal towards the Catholic population that was converted by force. Now, there's another parallel for today. We go and we look out at these countries and we say, oh, those Shias and those Sunnis. My goodness, I don't think the Shias and the Sunnis have anything compared to what the Protestants and Catholics got up to.
Yeah.
Maybe we didn't do it in terms of numbers, but in terms of brutality, my goodness, yes.
Good God, the 30 years of war.
It was brutal, and it was right across Europe. So if we and then we had, I'll finish here. We had the famous author known as Shakespeare, who came along and sewed everything up, sewed up the sow's ear as a silk purse, and made everything look wonderful. He was the great propagandist of Gloriana, of Elizabeth I, which is why I'm convinced it wasn't just some old guy from Stratford. This was a state-level operation of propaganda. Shakespeare was essential to the survival of Elizabeth I and the subsequent English governments, English Scottish governments. And there's no way that was just some random occurrence by some Glover's son from Stratford. So you've got the element of the forcible religious conversion, the police state, and the censorship stroke propaganda. And by the way, the British, everybody talks about the inventing of printing, which was very crucial. Gutenberg and his press, and the spread of newspapers. Well, do you know that England was one of the last places to get newspapers? Because under the Tudors, including Elizabeth I, they forbid any independent press. There were only two theatre companies in England. One was owned by the monarch, the King's men or the Queen's men, and the other one was the Lord Chamberlain's men. And the Lord Chamberlain, of course, was number two to the King, to the monarch. So you had no independent theatre, you had no press, you had complete control of what was the multimedia of the day, which was the theatre, by the government. There was absolutely no freedom of thought in Elizabeth I's England. And then you got the propaganda. Of course, one of these two companies, theatre companies, was Shakespeare's, putting out this entire story which demonized all previous kings and queens and presented the current regime as absolutely glorious.
Right.
Well, you are talking about a great parallel with today. And I think this is, I'll shut up now, but there's a lot of people on the alt media now who are saying, of course, everything's Britain. On the one hand, you've got one finger that points to Israel. It is all Israel. And the other one points is it's all the British.
Mhm.
But the British one probably has a lot of credibility to it, at least in the sense that the British have done all this once before, and they perfected it under Elizabeth I, and they have the same system. And in some cases, in the case of the Salisbury Cecil family, the same families in power 450 years later, playing powerful behind the scenes roles
Mhm.
in British politics. So the continuities, at least in the way government is run, and this interplay between religion, stroke ideology, police state, and censorship, they're all in place today, as they have been in place for 450 years.
Mhm. Yeah, no, and Walsingham, of course, famously the counterintelligence chief of the age, and then you have a somewhat similar situation when Cromwell comes to power with another similar type of police state using the Puritans and the New Army, and I can't remember the name of his intelligence chief, but there was one. His was pretty good as well, and kind of forgotten in history, but mainly because English decided they didn't like Cromwell after a little bit. But we've seen so many of these types of things coming out of England. I never really thought of it before you mentioned it. It was a police state in that particular way, but yeah, all the plays designed to make the Tudors look good and denigrate a lot. Certainly the Plantagenets, but some of them get along okay. But I mean, like some of the certain, yeah, they definitely want to make Richard out to be evil as hell, and I'm descended from his wife, so.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, no, the discovery of was it Richard whose body was found not long ago?
Yep, they found
Yeah.
basically under a parking lot.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
That's
that
how they
was
figured out he didn't have the humpback. He had scoliosis.
Yeah, yeah. The demonization of their enemies was dramatic.
Mhm.
One of my regrets writing about geopolitics is my first love is indeed looking through the Shakespearean plays and their connections to the politics of the day.
Mhm.
And there's just less, you can't do both. It's such a deep pool of knowledge. But that's why I tend to go up to the kind of the architecture, the roof over the whole thing, and just look at those look down at the main pillars, and those main pillars, being these ideological and police state and censorship elements, and I can't demolish them. I can't remove those pillars because they seem to be so strong. And we know that the whole point of a state like England is to learn from its methods of rule.
Mhm.
And once it's learned those methods of rule, it doesn't throw them away. You don't throw something away until it's broken, while it continues to work. And it works in England because the people have been so well trained. This is one of the remarkable things which I noticed, particularly living outside the country and
Mhm.
looking in at the newspapers, and I'm stunned at how people can be kind of directed into a line. Think of a sheep pen, though I don't want to be rude, but to be directed into a line with so few words.
Mhm.
I mean, think of what the dog does. The sheepdog, he doesn't bite the sheep. He doesn't chase the sheep. All he has to do is he does a little movement with his body. He kind of swishes his bum and his tail,
Mhm.
and he kind of points his head, and the sheep just take the hint, and they all
Mhm.
run in the right direction. He doesn't really have to do anything except kind of scurry around them a little bit. And this is what the press does. It does it with little hints in Britain. And most of the time, the press is actually full with complete nonsense. If you look at the English press, it's remarkable. They've had, for decades, the same stories, and they don't change.
Right.
They have on television a long-running program called The Great Bake Off, which is a competition where you make pies or cakes. And people just compete to make cakes, and that's fair enough. It's all right. I like making a nice meat pie or something when I have the money to buy the ingredients, which isn't often because it all boils down. You can have a lot of meat to make a nice meat pie. Then they've got Strictly Come Dancing, which they just call Strictly now. They just have to use the word strictly, and everybody knows this means Strictly Come Dancing. You see, they've whittled everything down to one phrase, two syllables. They've got the Doctor Who series, which I watched when I was a kid in the 1970s. It's a pastiche of what it was then. It's absolute nonsense.
Oh yeah, I haven't been able to watch anything since the Doctor Who special, the 50th anniversary stuff.
Yeah. John Pertwee probably, or someone like that, or the one before him whose name I can't forget. These were actors who had that kind of mesmeric quality, where they just had to look into the camera. And you got to shiver down your spine like this. This is the boss. This is the wizard.
Yeah.
And since then they've declined into parodies of actors. I mean, they're not even actors. They're just they're nowadays they're tokens for ideologies. This one's transgender. This one's a girl pretending to be a boy pretending to be okay. Fair enough, but where's the acting?
Yeah.
I mean,
where's the
after
writing?
all, there's nothing new. There's nothing new about transgender. If you go back to Elizabeth I, women weren't allowed on stage, so every woman on a stage was played by a boy.
Yeah.
So there's nothing new in acting about girl plays boy or boy plays girl, and yet that's supposed to be the headline feature. No. The point is, how well does that boy play the girl? How well does that girl play the boy? That's what should matter, not the mere their mere presence in front of the cameras. So the whole thing has gone to pot. But that's another darn story.
Yeah,
that's contemporary. Am I trying to avoid contemporary? We're trying to find the roots of what's going on today in the weeds at least 200 years ago, if not longer. I could say about Ukraine and Russia.
Yep.
It's really, really interesting that we mentioned earlier that the 1917 putsch and the revolution, which occurred some years earlier, actually in 1905, that was an attempt, in my view, to put the Russians off the oil stage. We know from the historian Simon Sebag Montefiore, who's very well known for his biographies of Stalin and other characters, and he's close to the Rothschild family. He's related to the Rothschild family. He wrote a letter to, I don't know who it was, whether it's the late Jacob Rothschild, possibly would have been most likely the head of the British branch of the family. He said, "Guess what I've just discovered in my papers?" And he was, I think, over here in Georgia looking through paperwork, and he said, "Stalin was your employee on 2 occasions." Stalin worked in Batumi, which was the Black Sea port where the oil, originally kerosene and later oil, outflowed onto the boats. And
On
later,
the Caspian, I believe.
yes, Stalin was working on the Caspian in Baku. So Batumi and Baku, the two ends of the line,
Mhm.
as a kind of a troublemaker, strike creator, not a strike breaker, a strike creator. Apparently, he was accused of killing his manager at one point. Never got fired. Never got fired by the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds apparently financed his printing press because he was famously the guy who ran the newspapers, printing the leaflets for Lenin. And then, of course, he turns up in Russia after Lenin's death, taking over the system. So you do have to wonder whether Stalin wasn't a functionary of the Rothschilds.
Oh yeah, well look at Trotsky.
Yeah.
In New York, has a car, has a electric fridge, and then goes up
in
Russia
the 1910s, an electric fridge. Can you believe it?
Yeah, and he's some obscure day laborer or something like that. He's working in a factory and is printing out a paper. And what I learned when I read a book called The Fall of Tsarist Russia, because Trotsky shows up with all the money they need to fund the revolution. What happened? The czars were worried that their money printing would be their printers would go on strike, and they really needed to inflate the economy, so they moved all the printing press to New York.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so Trotsky gets stopped at the Canadian border because they're like, "Who are you? And why do you have all this Russian money?" And then the phone call comes down and says, "Okay, you gotta let him go."
Yep, let him go. And it was the British, I understand, who, of course, were in control of Canada, who let him go. I think it was the port of Halifax. But anyway, yes, on he went. No, they were, and Lenin, on the other hand, with the German help. There was a book published by a British military spy that talked about the German financing of the Bolsheviks, and this was their most sore point. They couldn't really hide Trotsky's background in the US. But they didn't like the suggestion that somebody was financing Lenin, because that money was coming from Germany, and the Germans were, of course, the Germans were the great rivals in the Bolshevik eyes. The Bolsheviks wanted to mimic the industrial production lines of the Ford factories and the U.S. industry, and they hired a lot of American industrial consultants to come and set up Russian industry in the 1930s. But they didn't like any connection with the Germans, even though the Germans were equally connected. The Germans were producing combustion engines in Russia, and apparently one of the reasons the Russian tanks were so effective initially was because they had a huge supply of BMW engines, which had all been made in Russia, which they could put into the tanks, and that's your main point. You've got a working engine, you've got a working tank. But all of this was very, very touchy, very touchy for them. And because these are the layers of deception behind which the banking and oil interests are hiding. And I mean, to this day, if you say oil are bankers, or you mention, I use the phrase, which I use as a catch-all. I used it just as I've always said it's just a calling card to say Rockefeller, Rothschild, and Rex. In other words, the British royal family, the Rockefellers, and the Rothschilds. Of course, there were other interests involved. But,
I mean, like one side benefit of the Bolsheviks taking over in Russia is they basically abrogated all the debt that they owed to bondholders. And which country was most heavily bought into the Russian bond market, but France.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. And there's lots of old banking families, and there's lots of research goes into the Venetians, and as we're seeing today. I mean, just as the bankers could move from Rome, they could move to Venice, they could move from Venice to Antwerp, they could move from Antwerp to London. Well, it's about time for them to move somewhere else, and uh,
Dubai is what I hear.
I suspect it's going to be that, because a lot of people are saying, Tucker Carlson floated the idea that China is too difficult to control, although it was set up by the Rockefellers, who Yale educated Mao. He was in a Yale school. He wasn't the primary Chinese independence leader.
Mhm.
Now, it was Sun Yat-sen, and Sun Yat-sen was sidelined by Mao. Why? Well, Mao was the one with the Yale Rockefeller connections, and who then comes in to advise Mao? But a bunch of people like Anna Louise Strong, who strangely is the cousin of Maurice Strong of the Climate Change United Nations project, and then several famous Jewish Bolsheviks. That's not quite so surprising, because, of course, if you've got a communist leader, you're going to get the Russians, who previously had their revolution, come over and support him. And despite all denials, of course, large numbers of Bolsheviks were Jewish, and that's why you had the names escape me just for a moment, but two or three very significant individuals who stood by Mao's side for decades, absolute decades. But my mind is no. You had these various social experiments. I think the Italian fascists were more or less organic, although there are questions over that, because Mussolini himself was taking money from MI6. Then you had the Third Reich experiment. In the background, the Bolshevik experiment, and then the Chinese experiment. It's a fair question to ask if these weren't testings of different systems, prior to settling on one that worked.
Yep.
Communist system was a bit of a disaster, but as Anthony Sutton points out, the Western corporations put as much money as they possibly could into making the Russian system work, the Soviet system work. I mean, Ford, I think, was a commercial deal. He moved an entire factory from Dearborn. It was an old factory, and he got gold for it. So I think that was just a smart deal by Ford. But all kinds. Alfred Kahn is the guy who wrote the 5-year plans. So the 5-year plans were coming out of the US. The Swedes and all kinds of other companies were building the turbines for the dams. All these dams, which are periodically get blown up in Ukraine, are all dams which were built by General Electric and the Swedes and various other corporations. You could say that from the Western point of view, they're our dams, which are being blown up many, many decades later. What I'm trying to say is that these were playgrounds. They were experimental fields. They were sandboxes, if you will, in the modern phrase, for the great powers of the West, the money power, the military power, the industrial power, to test out ideas. And sometimes you want to test ideas in a place far away from home.
Yeah.
And those can be good ideas, like, we're trying to create a new society and we're trying to see if it can't be run on different grounds. And sometimes these are evil ideas, as we're seeing in Gaza, where Palantir is out there with its systems of identifying people and creating kill lists for the military, all in the name of efficiency, of course. It doesn't take so many soldiers now to sit and pore through paper documents and to identify targets. We can just basically leave it to the machines. And this was exposed, of course, not by Western journalists. This was exposed by Israeli journalists.
Yep.
At 972, the magazine, and Ynet and other Israeli outlets, who detailed thoroughly how this technology, this AI technology, is being tested in Gaza. And you have to be an absolute numbskull to think that this won't come home and be used to some extent on, in our own societies. Of course it will.
They're already testing some of that stuff out in the States and some of the more restricted neighborhoods.
Yes, I mean, I don't know if ICE is using it or whatever, but it's all related, isn't it? The facial recognition and the tracking of phone calls and the creation. I mean, the worst aspect, to my mind, of what Palantir has been doing in Gaza is not so much the facial recognition, but this technology which simply groups people by association. So, say there's a cafe where Hamas sits, but you happen to be a student round the corner, and that's also the nearest cafe for you. So you go round to that cafe, you may not have any, well, I mean, once you're there, you probably realize it's a Hamas cafe, but you may not have known that before you walked in there. But now your phone has shown that you have been in exactly the same place as these Hamas guys. Well, now you're on the list, and you may have just gone to get a coffee and a sticky bun, and this is the problem with this, because there is a huge area, a huge gray area with AI. I mean, anyone who uses it, I'm trying to download another version tonight, another one to test, but with all of these AIs, there's huge gray areas. And to make there's no decision more categorical than the decision to eliminate you.
Yeah.
And if that decision is made on the basis that you walked into the wrong damn cafe on the wrong day, when a bunch of nefarious guys happen to be holding a meeting in the back room, well, yeah, that's a nasty system, and that's the way it's going. And if you had a human overseeing that, that's the difference. You see, the human may have said, "Oh, come on, this guy's he's 17.
Yeah,
he's a math student. He's probably not one of them. Leave him off the list." But the AI system isn't going to do that. The AI system is going to say, I got a positive. I linked him to those people. And that's it. That's the end of him.
Yep. Reminds me of an old science fiction show we had in Canada. It was only one season, called Total Recall 2070, but it was more like a Blade Runner than Total Recall, Electric Dreams of Sheep. It had this one late episode where this cop discovers there's this conspiracy, and the conspirators say, look, the world is run by a supercomputer, but it doesn't know how to make in order to eliminate one person, it'll send it might derail an entire train to get rid of that guy. We exist to guide it and eliminate just the one guy.
Yeah, exactly. What's the level of collateral damage which you can tolerate?
Yeah.
And AI seems to be absolutist not in a political sense, but in a mathematical sense.
Right.
It just said, well, there's a bad guy on that train. Yeah, but there's 20 civilians in the same coach. Well, it doesn't matter. We got the bad guy. We're going to get the bad guy.
Yeah.
And a human isn't going to make that decision. A human is going to say, okay, let's wait until the train gets to the next station. We'll send people to the station. We'll get him when he gets off the train, or we'll board the carriage and we'll risk deaths in the carriage. But, probably that'll be 5 dead rather than all of them.
Yeah.
And the drone is, no, let's just go drone that carriage. We've got the guy.
Mhm.
Tick the box.
Yeah.
And that's, that's the direction it's going. We saw that in the 12-day war in Iran, where they took out the leaders
Mhm.
of various nuclear research institutions and military figures. They took them out in their apartments. Well, in those apartments was their family.
Yeah.
And they said, well, no, that's okay. We got the target. And that's, I don't think, and I'm not making any apologies for the Israeli Defense Forces here, but I'm thinking that approach is probably worsening the more paranoid tendencies of, a small country that perceives itself surrounded by enemies. AI is worsening our own kind of like uh, tendencies towards violence, because it's saying, well, first of all, you don't have accountability because that was the AI decision, it wasn't you. And secondly, it alerts us to a potential, it magnifies the threat. I mean, AI, without doubt, I mean, a top-down view of a city, for example, go to any of these cities, particularly in Europe, that have large numbers of Arab students coming over to study.
Mhm.
You take a top-down view, and you can magnify the threat from any campus in terms of who is there, if you look at it through that lens. And this is the whole point. Which I return to time and again. It's a point of perspective and lens. Where you stand with your lens, which lens you choose. A photographer understands this very, very well. What you see is entirely dependent on where you stand and what lens you take. And yeah, well, AI doesn't make that distinction.
Okay, so a little breaking there. I was just looking at some news, and IRGC is claiming that the Strait of Hormuz is closed, but does not actually look to be closed. So they're just claiming they're going to shoot at people in there, but they haven't shot at anyone.
I suspect what's happened, or what I saw earlier, was those apps which track the flow of traffic, tankers through the strait, showed that they had slowed down, so that
Yeah.
they were hanging around and waiting to see whether to go today or tomorrow or whatever. So it's not formally closed, it seems, but it's kind of vacant.
Yeah.
Just like a roundabout where
Mhm.
just seems everyone's sitting at the traffic light and no one's going.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen any. Well, I haven't looked for any recent updates.
No, I just found one from 22 minutes ago. It just says the IRG. It's from ANHA news agency, and it basically says, Iran is claiming they've closed the strait, but they haven't actually done anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a threat from Iran that it would wait until the evening for further strikes,
Mhm.
and obviously that evening is sort of come now.
Mhm.
But whether that was bluster or whether that was a real threat, we'll
Yeah.
wait and see.
Yeah, because I think it's actually very. I don't think they want to do that as their first strike, because that'll piss off all their neighbors who have been quietly siding with them, blocking airspace and to the Americans and the Israelis. So
Yeah, the feeling I got from watching the attacks today was that it seemed to be a first round.
Mhm.
There were a couple of strikes or multiple strikes on the U.S. naval base in Bahrain.
Okay.
That was one area that blew up rather large, looked like it might have been a munitions depot.
Hmm.
The other one that was clearly attacked was a radar installation. And then there was another claimed attack on a radar installation in Qatar. So those were the two main casualties, excluding obviously human. There were a lot of girls killed in a school with a missile that may have been U.S. Israeli, or it may have been an Iranian misfire that hit a school. But in terms of the installations, it was really Bahrain and Qatar were the two targets, but they weren't followed up by massive
Yeah.
secondary attacks. And of course, we don't know what happened in Israel because the Israeli government has banned people from filming and revealing attacks, and it doesn't announce anything. So we don't know how many missiles. There was a comment about several hundreds of missiles being fired at Israel and possibly being downed, but there was no confirmation of how many got through and what they did.
Yeah.
So we just don't know. But overall, from what we do know, it looks like this is a kind of a series of strikes, which leaves open the door to stop this. Kind of like what happened with the 12-day war.
Yeah.
It's like there's like a volley. Okay, you're going to respond to this volley. If you do, I'll send another volley.
Stage managed.
Exactly, kind of stage managed, and then at any point we can call this off, because if Iran wanted to have fired everything that it's got, it could have done. It didn't do that, and likewise, U.S. Israel could have sent a lot more over, and they didn't. So I don't know. I mean, let's hope that it could. That would be the best outcome. That it becomes like a squaring up, and then indeed some kind of deal is struck. Because whatever happens, a deal has to be struck at the end of it. I mean, even if you demolish a country, you still have to. You have to deal with the consequences of it. And I think we're getting to the point. This is something, again, this now is above my pay grade. But in terms of demolition, we saw what happened to Iraq. We saw what happened to Libya in terms of, semi-functional states remaining. And you can get away with a number of those, perhaps, in a region. But I would think that once you create enough unstable states, then you get a problem.
Yeah.
I
don't believe Russia will allow
there's a kind of a
state on its border.
No, exactly. There's the question of Russia and China. And you've got the question of mass, of mass instability, volume of instability. It's one thing to have, Iraq semi-unstable. It's one thing to have Syria simmering, which it is at the moment. Nobody quite knows which way it's going to go. There are these reports that the ISIS jails have been opened, that you now have ISIS fighters all over the place. The debate is going on as to whether those ISIS fighters are going to side with the government in terms of, just coalesce under the ruling authority, or whether they're going to devolve into gang fights and challenge the government. Nobody actually knows that at the moment. So Syria is kind of in flux. Iraq is more of a known quantity, partly because you've got very strong powers on the borders, such as Turkey controlling various elements. Turkey's got an interest in taking land, but it's also got an interest in stability. But once if you throw Iran into that pot, then you've got it's a completely different story. It's a much bigger country, many more people. So I think there is an interest there's a scope for saner heads or calmer minds, calmer prospects. We'll see. It depends.
On the other hand, I was looking at the map for Russia and Ukraine yesterday. Russian forces are about 100 miles from Odessa.
Yeah, I think they're pushing in that direction. They dearly love to get to Odessa because cutting Ukraine from the sea looks, from the Russian point of view, essential to the security of its naval forces, because the whole reason it wanted Crimea was for its warm water port. And if it's got Ukraine and other forces, such as the British, experimenting with new forms of water drones to go and ram into the side of Russian ships, as they did to the Moskva, which they sent to the bottom. Well, there's no point in having Crimea. You haven't got a warm water port, so they've really got to push on to Odessa, and that's going to be an interesting thing in itself.
Yep.
Whether they can do it, and how the European response. That's almost a different podcast. I mean, the European situation is so complicated. It's so conflicted and confusing and self-defeating, of course, because the Europeans are almost going down in the fight. They're determined to turn their economies into a militarized economy so that they can fight Russia. But in the process, they're in this deindustrialization, degrowth. They've shut off their energy. They haven't got any real replacement for the cheap Russian gas. And so it's they say that, well, Russia's going to attack within on a timeline of 3, 5, or 7 years. Well, the Europeans haven't got more than 3, 5, or 7 years. That's the reason for this timeline. Because if you go out beyond 7 years, there is no European industry. There is no Europe left to fight Russia. So they've got to do it within 3, 5, or 7 years, and that's the reason they set this deadline. It's a self-inflicted one. It really, what the Europeans have got to gain from this, I don't know. But then again, the British fought the First and Second World War. If the troops going off to the First and Second World War had known what would happen to Britain, they wouldn't have fought those wars.
No, they would not have.
There was the loss of lifestyle, there was the loss of wealth, there was the loss of colonies, and above all, there was a loss of people, and there was nothing to gain from it. Europe as a whole went from manufacturer to the world to a debtor and a colony to the US. And what did they fight those two wars for? Nothing that benefited those nations. Nothing at all. And I think that the war with Russia is looking, to my mind, exactly like that. It's a copycat of the same thing. It's another war from which Europe would gain absolutely nothing. And it would simply beggar itself. It would beggar itself.
I think they're headed for revolution.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's. I've long wondered about this whole sort of inward migration thing and the chaos on the streets, whether somebody isn't playing a game where they want to provoke a kind of a Weimar conflict, where they have countries which are brought to their knees and then reach out to a radical leader and lash out against their populations and create, the same sort of chaotic situation. I mean, it's a long shot, but on the other hand, I can't see any logical reason for why Western European economies are being destroyed in the way that they are. There's no logic for it. There's nothing to gain.
Mm.
But they have all these politicians who follow policies which they don't explain with the rest of us. For
Mhm.
example, you take the British government and Starmer, they don't level with the British people. Macron in France doesn't level with the French people. He's never done a television address
Huh.
where he said, "We're doing this because."
Mhm.
You've never had that. Mind you, you never had that in Canada from Trudeau. He never
Yep.
sat down and said to the Canadian people, "We've got to do this because." It was always a kind of a hectoring. This is why they employ so many actors as presidents. There's this sort of actorial hectoring of the people.
Mhm.
Well, you've got to take the shot. You got to do this. You got to do that. And if you're not, you're a fascist.
Mhm.
And that was it, time and again. You're either gonna do what we say, or you're an extremist.
Yep.
It's kind of a passive aggressive, what Ian Burlingame calls estrogen politics.
Mhm.
It's passive aggressive. You got to go along with this because otherwise you're just a nasty person. And you know what? We're not even going to talk to you if you don't go along with us. You're beyond the pale.
Mhm.
But at no point do any of these leaders sit down and say, "Well, why are you doing what you're doing? We're doing it because of this.
Mhm.
The country needs this. You need this. We need this. You're going to gain this." None of this is addressed. No one ever addresses, for example, in the case of the migration, why the caliber of people who are being admitted are predominantly unskilled for an economy which is deindustrializing
Yeah.
and therefore has no need for manual, low-skilled, or even basic factory-level worker. We just
Right.
don't have any jobs for them at all.
Mhm.
So the migrants are being brought in under false pretenses because there is no work for them. The only thing they're going to get, if the governments are willing to do it, which they seem to be willing to do, is welfare benefits.
Yep.
That's the only thing that's attracting people. I don't know about Canada. I don't know so much about the US, but in the UK, certainly when they were a member of the European Union and they were switching from industrial to service sector economy, the baristas were, Polish and Eastern European, baristas, plumbers, the working class.
Yep.
But I mean, with respect, I mean working class, working people who were coming to work.
Yep.
And we've now gone a level beyond that. We've now got people who aren't coming with skills. There were some who you couldn't teach them to make a coffee if you tried.
Mhm.
And that's not a joke. You just couldn't.
Okay.
They wouldn't make a coffee. They couldn't make it. They're not there. They're not there. And what's the point? What are we offering them? Nothing.
Yep.
And if you reverse the conversation that way, by the way, and I'll leave it here, but if you turn it around and instead of attacking the migrants, criticize the government and say, what are we offering these people? And then you have a very strong argument because we're offering them nothing. We have nothing to give them. In fact, in many cases, if you established them in small businesses in their own countries, they do a lot better because they'd be dealing with lower costs of living.
Yep.
They'd be dealing with a growing economy, developing, emerging market, not a post-industrial market. And so the place where young entrepreneurial wannabe individuals should be working is in many cases the countries from which migrants are coming, the countries that they're leaving.
Yep.
and come to post-industrial Europe. What the heck is going on?
Mhm.
And we did see one little clue, which takes us back to the whole war thing, which is that Canada and Ireland this month announced that they would fast-track migrants into the armed forces, or rather not fast-track them, but offer them, if they joined the armed forces, a fast track to citizenship.
Yeah.
And that was an interesting argument. Maybe that's why they're being brought over, because these countries cannot persuade their own native populations
They
to serve
could.
as
They're just, I can tell you in Canada's case, the reason why you don't get a lot of people I tried to join, and our recruitment system is terrible.
Really? Why is
Yeah,
that?
because I thought my story was just a one-off, but I have a new stepbrother, and he's in the Canadian Armed Forces, and he said that happens that happens all the time. What happened to you?
Really?
Yeah, he
They're
says
turning people down. They're turning locals down.
yeah, they screw up the date, so they say you need to apply by this time. So I showed up on the for the officer's job on the day they gave me, and they said, "Oh, we changed that date. You missed the chance." So I said, "Fine, I'll join being enlisted," because they still offered that, and I came in on the day for the enlistment, and they said, "We changed the date on you." With no notification. And then by that time, the next year I was working full time and doing probably what I've been doing for the Army. So that was kind of, and he says that's a very common thing that happens. And I tell that to Americans, and they're like, if you had tried to join the Army or the Marines or the Air Force, you would have been in a car the next day, on a bus the next day. They found it
Yeah.
shocking. They were like,
Well,
you'd be on the bus.
this is again a topic for a different podcast, but
Yeah.
there is something in common. You have to look at what's happening in the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand separately from what's happening in the US. There is something different happening in the Anglosphere, in the dominions. There is something different going on, and maybe they don't want nationals in the army. Maybe they want a kind of international mercenary force in place of a traditional homegrown army. I don't know. I'm just spitballing.
I think that's certainly true of Europe doing that. But Mertz kind of realized, he passed the conscription and then realized he's going to only real source of manpower is 400,000 Muslims. And then he's like, I'm not too sure this is such a good idea.
That's
We're
right.
a bit late to be thinking about that.
Well, they've been doing it for a long time, and there's only two explanations. One is that it's incompetence, and the other that it's deliberate. And the jury's out.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's deliberate. It's a combination of the two. The leadership class is chosen deliberately to be incompetent.
That without doubt. Yeah, the incompetent, it can be for one of two reasons. One is that they are pushovers; they just take orders because they cannot think for themselves. So they're very, very easy to control. The other is that it's a demoralization ritual in that they would like to replace these incompetent politicians with artificial intelligence. And the best way to get us to agree to control by AI is to say, look, these politicians aren't you glad to see the back of these lousy politicians? And then people will say, yes, give me an AI judge. Let my divorce or my custody battle or my fraud conviction be settled by a robot. Because we don't trust these corrupt judges, and we're seeing it in the judiciary as well. I mean, the corruption of the judiciary in Britain is off the charts. It's not hidden. You have all kinds of judges with conflicts of interest. Whether it's country, they're associated with a particular country, and then they're ruling over cases involving that country, or they are connected to nefarious,
So
from
JP points out,
corruption to pedophilia, all kinds of weird cases with the child grooming cases, where these judges are connected to people who themselves are involved with the child abuse. And we're supposed to pretend this doesn't happen. I think it's a humiliation ritual where we will eventually be told, look, you don't need jury. We've been told in Britain already that jury cases are going away, except for capital crimes such as murder. And I think we'll next be told that judges are going away, and that you'll just basically sit in front of a bot, and the bot will have access to everything that you've done and everything that your employer's ever done, and it will put the two together, and it will decide whether your termination at your company was fair or not, on the basis of comparing your record and your employer's record. And the computer will do that.
Yeah, and JP points out in the chat, homegrown armies are less likely to turn on their own fellow citizens, which is definitely a truth. But the problem for that argument is that the bringing in a group like that, the way the Europeans have done, is basically, why wouldn't they just take over? Like when the Roman Empire finally fell in the West, it was because the Goths or whoever it was just said, why should we just take your orders from you anymore? We're in charge now.
Yeah. As I understand, what the Romans did was the oligarchs, the wealthiest families, decided they didn't need the locals anymore. They were happy to hire foreigners. The armies likely went mercenary, and so again, without having armies who are loyal to the nation, you just got mercenaries who will fight for whoever. And then you've got the problem that they can be turned because you send them off to a foreign land, and they realize they've got a better deal fighting for the other side. And this is the problem. This is what we're facing. Now, that doesn't matter to the oligarch, because the oligarch is sitting above the nation, and he's looking at it purely from the transactional point of view. He can do a deal with the other oligarch, and they can say, well, okay, so you screwed your country and I screwed my country, but we can take the wealth, and we can move that wealth into a third country. And we're seeing something like that going on in the West at the moment. It's almost as if they don't need us anymore, and that money isn't tied down to the countries where we live.
Right.
All that's in our countries is the resources under the ground. Canada is a huge resource-rich country. Australia, massive resource-rich country. They don't really need the people sitting on top of the land. In fact, they'd quite like the people off the land so that they can dig it all up. And then they can move their financial center of operations somewhere else. Today, we know from the money system that financial operation of center of operations no longer needs necessarily to be a traditional country with ports and military centers, etc. Why couldn't it just be some bunch of islands somewhere, the Caribbean, or off the coast of Asia, or in between large countries? Think of Maui, where the fires were, in Lahaina, where quite clearly they haven't rebuilt that after 3 or 4 years. Where are these little centers of operations going to be placed, from which the larger land masses are exploited? It's a dark thought, but if you go back to the sci-fi writers of the past 80 years, they saw the rulers kind of dominating planets
Mhm.
and or moving to different planets and playing off one planet against another, one population against another. Well, just transpose that back onto Earth,
Mhm.
and what you've got is, within the Earth, you've got the rulers working from this archipelago, that constellation of islands, playing off this large territory against that large territory. I think we're not that far off.
I think that's what Trump's trying to undo, is that system, and he's bringing back the American system of economy that got hijacked by the British and the oligarchs during World War One and Two.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
Let's hope so. Well, should we call it a day? I should
Yep.
get back to watching what's happening, and I need to be up early tomorrow to
Mhm.
pick up the pieces.
Yep.
It was
Thanks
great
for
talking
coming
to
on
you.
board and having the thing, and I'm going to share this with a few groups of people.
Great.
Okay.
Talk to you again soon.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.
And if you are watching at home, like this stuff and want to see more, please like, share, and subscribe. Bye-bye.